So I'm delighted to be talking today with Professor Andrew Walder. Andy is a professor of sociology at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He is a longtime observer, a very acute observer of China and Chinese politics. And what I want to discuss today is really the question of where China stands in its overall developmental trajectory, because there has been an argument that that we've reached a kind of peak China. This remarkable growth story that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years is not going to continue forever. And I wonder, how the COVID, what's turning out to be the COVID debacle in Chinese politics plays into this, and other decisions that have been made by the Chinese leadership over the past few years. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, the COVID pandemic and the lockdown came after a long-term trend of increasing indebtedness in the corporate sector in China. And this goes back to, actually, we can kind of set this up by talking about the mid-early 2000s, 2005, 2006. There was a major economic conference, I think, in the western hills of Beijing, and all of the Chinese economists there and government officials agreed that the investment-heavy growth model that they'd used over the previous 30 years, which had worked well, was coming to its use by end date. So they began to prepare plans for moving away from investment-driven and moving to more a different financial system, different banking system that didn't give state-owned firms such soft budget constraints, which they continue to have to a considerable extent. And as they were preparing, the global financial crisis hit. And their response to that was an emergency response, which at the time, you may recall, Paul Krugman and others were admiring the Chinese efforts to prop up their growth rate, which kept up demand in the global economy and so forth. But the method they used was to pump loans through the state bank system into infrastructure projects, primarily through local governments and state-owned enterprises.
And I believe at that time they were pumping something like 50% of GDP.
I don't know how high. I don't know how high it was. I think it was closer to 15%.
Oh.
But the numbers elude me, but it was huge. And the bottom line looked a lot in terms of shovel-ready projects was much larger than our own TARP and tax cuts and so forth, which we used. And the result of that, not surprisingly, they built out the high-speed rail system. They built all kinds of housing. They built all kinds of beautiful new airports all over the country. The highway system was built out, container ports. I mean, it's fantastic, their infrastructure, because it's mostly new and relatively good. But it led to non-performing loans. And this showed up in the national balance sheet as a doubling of the overall debt in the Chinese economy by 2013, 2014. But what was unique about it is that it was unusually concentrated in the corporate sector. There are basically three components to overall national debt. One is household debt, which in a consumer-driven economy, that's a large component. It's a relatively small component in China up to the present day. Government debt, of which we have quite a bit, but it's long-term, and because of the dollar system, we can continue to issue bonds, which the Chinese buy and others, and Japanese buy. But the third component is corporations. And in a fully marketized economy like our own, if you have too much debt, you basically start getting your credit cut off. In China, the opposite happens. If a state-owned firm, which has carried out government policy directives, runs into difficulties, those loans are rolled over. And they continue to be rolled over. So even someone like myself, who has a total of one semester of economics taken 35 years ago from Carl Christ at Johns Hopkins, can understand that if you're having in a bank-driven, China's a bank-driven financial system, overwhelmingly state-owned. So in a bank-driven financial system, if new loans are going to retire old loans, which increasingly they are, Nick Lardy has a book on this that came out 2 or 3 years ago that showed this decisively. That means that the investment-driven stimulus is not going to work. It's just keeping. So it's inevitable that the growth rate is going to go down and down and down. And they were struggling to keep it at 6%. For political reasons, for some reasons, the leadership gave itself a report card for meeting, high growth targets. Whereas the reform economists within China, and of course outside China, were constantly saying, look, you're going to have to accept a retrenchment or reorganization of the restructuring of the debt, maybe continued restructuring and downsizing of the state sector, which they stopped in 2008. And you're going to have to be willing to accept, in the short run, lower growth rates, maybe even negative, before you can take off again.
Yeah. So, it struck me that there are actually parallels between Japan and China. I mean, Japan had this big slowdown in the 1990s. They had a lot of zombie banks, and rather than allowing the banks to collapse, they kept pumping money. They kept the banks alive. They kept funding infrastructure projects in a vain effort to get their economy jump-started again. And eventually it collapsed. And I guess one of the things that I had always puzzled about in the case of China was that, conventional economics would tell you that something that can't go on forever is not going to go on forever, but the Chinese one looked like it was going on forever.
Yeah, well, they prolonged it for a long period. The parallels with Japan are, I think, haunting China's leaders. They've been raised many times. It's a very different kind of economy, Japan's is. But what you ended up with in Japan is the highest, of all the major economies by far, the highest levels of overall debt. But in terms of the components of debt, it's no longer focused on corporations. It's primarily government debt. It's about, what's the figure? 4 times, their debt is 4 times their GDP. China's now is around it's 320% of GDP, which is the same level as the US. But if you look at the composition of the Chinese debt, it's highly concentrated in corporations. So what they've done is, in Japan, they assumed the corporate debt through tax breaks and other things as government debt. They absorbed it. China hasn't done that yet. So you might ask, where do all these non-performing loans go? And China's learned a good deal from more sophisticated financial firms in the West, and they've created back in, I think it was about 15 years ago, when they were preparing their major banks for IPOs, international IPOs. They decided they had to clean up the balance sheets. They couldn't have all 20% of the loans non-performing. So they created something that was modeled after the Resolution Trust Corporation in the U.S., which cleaned up our savings and loan disaster in, when was that? In the 90s? I can't recall.
Yeah, late 90s.
So they created something called asset management corporations, and they created one corporation for each of the big 4 banks. And these 4 banks are now the four out of the 4 largest in the world in terms of assets. An asset in the banking system is a loan, right? So we shouldn't be that impressed with that, but the volume of their business is enormous. And what these asset management companies were supposed to do was to take the non-performing loans off their books, so they had good whatever ratios you need to get good ratings and so forth. And then to resolve those loans by negotiating with the company that had them, and to take someone had to take a haircut, right? So they were given initial funding from the Ministry of Finance, and they were supposed to negotiate with the debtors and take a less than the full value of the loan. The banks didn't take a haircut. The banks got 100% value. Now, the plan was to clean up the bank balance sheets and then wind them up. That's what the Resolution Trust Corporation did. But then, because the global financial crisis hit, they were issuing all kinds of new loans, right? And so I guess the Chinese government could say it's not our fault, it's Goldman Sachs' fault for creating the global financial, it's your financial system, but they decided to make them permanent, okay? And as time went on, they got more and more of these loans. And once they became permanent, some of the CEOs of these asset management companies decided to become creative. And instead of just negotiating case by case, they started to package these loans into tranches and sell them and act like a financial institution. And so they would take loans. They floated bonds on international markets. They sold these to borrowers and debtors and so forth, and they traded them. About 3 years ago, one of these big four asset management companies became insolvent because the CEO was being very reckless in the way he was expanding. He saw it as an empire to expand. Turned out he'd paid a few bribes and broken a few laws. But he was executed. He was executed. And they've had to go in and rescue the asset management. I've forgotten the name of it right now. It'll come to me later. They had to go in and restructure the ownership. And so the Ministry of Finance basically sold pieces of this to basically the National Wealth Fund, I believe, and CITIC, a major Hong Kong-based financial agency in Hong Kong. And they took an equity stake in return for a capital injection to make it whole, right? But we still have these collateralized debt obligation things floating around, and we don't know how this is going to work itself out. Okay, so there's a sequel to this. It worked so well to keep this. I don't know if you want to call it a bubble, but it really looked like this was going to be something that could stretch out for a long period of time. But over the same period of time, the big four banks that originally had this treatment were issuing a smaller and smaller percentage of national loans because regional and local banks began to expand. And they more quickly ran into trouble because their loan portfolios were more influenced by local governments that directly own these banks, right? So they decided to create asset management companies, one for each province. And then after a few more years, two for each province. And they begin to do the same things and begin to act, not just as resolution trust corporations, but as permanent entities that were constantly cleaning up the books. So there's a lot of worry about hidden debt that's out there that's not accounted for. We don't know. I won't even begin to talk about local government debt, but that's sort of related to this. So that's the big picture.
Yeah. The national government, though, still is sitting on a big pile of money, right? I mean, they've got a substantial reserve.
Yeah, everyone who's written about this, I think Christine Wong who used to work for the ADB in University of Melbourne most recently. She's now at East Asian Institute in Singapore. She's worked on China's fiscal system for the last 20 years. And she's shown, and everyone else that's looked at this has shown that the central government basically collects much more revenues than it's responsible for spending, and it remits it back to local governments. But there's always a shortfall for local governments since the mid-1990s, late 1990s, in local government budgets. So what have they done to make it up? They decided they were going to assert their property rights over land and use land sales, which basically is long-term lease, to generate income. Right. And that's what they've been doing. And in order for them to build infrastructure as part of this project, they're expropriating farmers from their land. And, they're selling the land to property developers. Local governments, as a result, in order to do this, they're forbidden from borrowing from banks. So they create local government financing vehicles, which are essentially, supposedly arm's length state-owned enterprises that are designated for specific projects. Yeah. And they've borrowed a lot of money, and these are non-performing loans. And now that's become a component of the overall national debt. That's because the central government can't control it, and they've tried to set limits, and they tried for a while to turn the debt into bonds that are traded, but only, except for the most prosperous regions of China, no one wants to buy these bonds. So
let's talk about the real estate sector more
Yeah.
specifically. One of the things that I've found the most fascinating is if you go on YouTube and you search for Chinese apartment buildings being blown up, you'll see many videos of, a block of, 12, 15, 30-story buildings that are all being dynamited. There's presumably been this massive misallocation of capital into this sector that they're really good. And that's basically where all this money has gone, right, is into these.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
A lot of it. Some of it went to airports and container ports and so forth, but that is an unusually large percentage of a major economy. The estimates are anywhere from 19% to 30% of GDP is in the real estate sector. If you look at the Chinese, China now has more corporations in the Fortune Global 500 than the U.S. They have 130. 5 of those are real estate development companies. No, there are no other real estate development companies in that ranking, right? So that gives you a sense of that this is a huge component, but it's also out of control. They're building much more, as you said. They build. So even before COVID hit China, or maybe it was shortly after, Xi Jinping decided to do something about it, and he decided that I won't go into the 3 red lines, but basically, the government issued an edict saying that you can't borrow more unless if you have if you can't meet these certain financial criteria, if you're overly leveraged, right? Well, most of them were overly leveraged, and Evergrande was the first to basically crash. They couldn't build the houses. They'd already taken advance payments because they were cut off from new bank loans. They started taking advance payments. They started selling wealth management products, right? It was shadow banking, essentially. And they started defaulting on their loans, on their bonds. Of course, it got a lot of international attention because they'd borrowed an international, they'd issued international bonds in dollars, but also domestic. And it wasn't just Evergrande, it was most of the major companies were defaulting. And then COVID hit, which didn't help, but I think it didn't fundamentally alter the underlying situation. And in the end, they've decided to abandon that policy, to lend money to them again, and so they haven't solved the problem. And what that shows is that it's very, very hard to deleverage any sector of the economy, whether it's real estate or some other sector, without taking a big hit, without it beginning to look like a financial crisis in other economies. Economists will tell you, and there are economists, World Bank economists, for example, who will tell you that we shouldn't ever talk about a Lehman moment in China because most of the finance comes out of the state banking system. So the kind of liquidity crisis that hit, Lehman Brothers is not going to happen. Essentially, in the end, this asset management company was bailed out because the government moved in and said, okay, this state financial institution will take an equity stake, and so they can do that, right? And they can do that, and so there's a lot of I don't want to call it complacency, but confidence that the Chinese government can handle that kind of thing. But the counter argument to that is that they can make missteps, and so when you have actors who are not directly under government supervision, like households who buy houses, right? Things can get out of control. So if demand for housing goes way down, then it doesn't matter if these real estate companies are bailed out. Their prospects going forward are going to be very different, and it's going to be very hard for them, I would assume, to raise capital internationally.
And what does this mean for social stability? You see these pictures of these desperate people that aren't going to get the apartments that they've already paid for. Do you think that that's going to have any impact?
Well, you have to ask yourself, why is the government the government has 2 major objectives. One is keep the growth rate up, but ultimately that's concern for social stability. And when they mean social stability, they mean political stability, the control, the Communist Party control. And what they're really worried about is that if there's a lot of protests, that the top leadership, which has decided to hang together rather than hang separately since Tiananmen in '89, that will start to crack. They're worried that will start to crack. So Xi Jinping is not just cracking down on human rights lawyers and feminists. He's also cracking down on other officials who might criticize him. Anyway, I've kind of lost.
Yeah, well, so
the
let's
direction.
talk about zero COVID
Right.
and its relationship to social stability. So we saw actually a lot of protests all over China, which was really the first time in a long time that that's happened.
Yeah.
Do you think that they're going to get this under control and things will go back to normal, or is there a longer term problem with regime legitimacy here?
Yeah, well, I guess the protest showed, the recent protest showed, and also the protests by people who were who had purchased homes that weren't going to be built. There was a lot of protests. There's a reason why the CCP has spent reportedly almost as much on internal security and surveillance as their military budget. Whether that's accurate or not, I don't know, but they work on that a lot. It's because Chinese people protest, and that's the only way they have, really, of pursuing their interest. And you know, there's a huge specialized political science literature on protest in China, how it's policed, how protesters mobilize. People, it is a difficult country to govern. And when people feel that their rights or their property is their life chances are damaged by government action, they have shown a real propensity to protest. The reaction to it looked as if the protests about COVID lockdowns was to abandon the policy. But another way of looking at it is that plus the fact that it was pretty clear that COVID had already escaped and they were not going to be able to control it anymore. So you could say that maybe that was a reaction to the protest, but maybe it was also a realistic decision that this new version of the virus is so contagious that our old way of handling it is not going to work. And in addition, as they're telling everyone now, it's really not that bad. It's like the flu.
No, that was quite an admission. Well, it wasn't an admission. I mean, it was quite a reversal, and it doesn't look like they prepared the new policy particularly well.
They did not prepare for an endgame. And this is one of the things about their system of governance that there are some people who tell you that it's not fragmented. It's really good at formulating and implementing policy. There's no political fragmentation or polarization. So some will argue it's a superior system of government. But it's good at the one thing that it sets out to do. And it kept doing that same thing and celebrating its own, bragging about it internationally, celebrating it domestically, identifying that policy with Xi Jinping, but it's pretty clear as a system of governance, they didn't do the other thing. They dropped the ball on vaccinations. They dropped the ball on building. I mean, they could build quarantine centers. They didn't build intensive care units in hospitals. I mean, this is just a no-brainer. I mean, and the resources that this government has to do these kind of things are enormous.
Right.
So, to me, it looks like they've turned what looked like a governance success into an embarrassing governance failure. They're just not prepared so they're just letting it just spread all over China. They're mum about actual number of cases and so forth. And I think the trust of people of course, the people that I know are all aghast. That's what's happening, but they're not a random sample of the Chinese population. But just about everybody I know in China has had COVID, or no one that I know directly has died yet, but they have relatives who have died. And they're not coming clean on what's happening. So I think this could be something of a turning point, but it's always hard to tell. Major turning points, we never predict them. They always surprise us, and then we construct structural arguments in retrospect to show that was inevitable. Which were also wrong.
So one other big issue that I want you to talk about is one that you presented in a seminar here at Stanford a few weeks ago, which has to do with inequality. And that China is really different from, certainly from European countries, in terms of putting in place a kind of welfare state that will really equalize outcomes. And I wonder if you could speak to that. I mean, you have a theory about why this is the case, but I think people are not aware of this, really.
Well, there are a lot of economists and sociologists who have tracked increasing inequality in China, and this has been a major subject.
Their Gini coefficient is somewhere in the 40.
Well, it depends. It depends on whose data. It's anywhere from the upper 40s, and some people claim it's as high as the lower 60s.
Wow, that's.
But it's very.
Because Brazil is like 58 or
Brazil,
something.
it's about in the high end surveys, it's about equivalent to Brazil. And what's puzzling. Usually the way that usually it's based on analyzing household level data. So how do you explain this? I mean, why would you explain it? I think the puzzle for me is we know why already somewhat high inequality in the United States has become worse over the last 30 years. We know about the role of political parties,
decline of unions,
over influence of gigantic donors and so forth to cut capital gains taxes and so forth and so on. So that's a story of state capture to some extent. And in Russia, you have a similar high level of inequality that's grown apace with the Putin era. We know that has something to do with oligarchs and corruption and so forth. Those stories don't hold for China. I mean, China didn't have a bunch of oligarchs that pulled apart capital, state enterprises, state resources at the outset of their transition.
The regime's really good at putting oligarchs in jail or killing them if they don't.
So then the question is, why is it that all the measures now of income inequality and wealth inequality put China on a par with Russia and the United States? And so that, I thought it was puzzling because we don't have that kind of explanation for China. We have the household, when you have equations of the determinants of household income, you can partition the parts, how much is due to region, how much is due to occupation, how much is due to this and that. But you're not explaining the big picture, right? So I felt, and that's what sociologists do. And so I
thank
felt,
God for sociology.
But I felt that we need to look at the broader political economy. It has to that'll be a higher level. And then it turns out all of these, as I looked at all of these policies that pushed high growth rates, they favored income flows, capital flows to the state and enterprises that were owned by the state, and they neglected the population. In other words, flows of, give you an example, I just talked earlier about local governments using land finance to raise their budgets. Well, every time they do that, every time they expropriate farmers for land, they're basically transferring value from the land that they're undercompensating like crazy, and that value goes to real estate development companies or to the local government in terms of, and so it's I don't want to say it's like Karl Marx's primitive accumulation, but it has, that is just one example of policies that transfer income to the state or to corporations, especially state-owned corporations that are getting bailed out by bank loans, and whose money is in the bank. It's savers. Savers, households have put their wealth into two places. One is to banks, where they get very low interest rates in order to keep the state-owned banks profitable, and the other is into housing. Right? So there's a bias towards concentrating wealth and income towards the government and government-related agencies, to some extent large private corporations. The other part of the puzzle is, if you look at the resources that the Chinese state has, they have enormous resources compared even to the wealthy countries in terms of the state's control over the financial system, the state's ownership of real assets, the state's ownership of all the land and all the all the telecommunications, everything, right? So they have a huge capacity to redistribute. So the question is, why don't they do it? And I'm guessing that because they're committed to this growth model that creates it. They're unwilling, for the same reason they're unwilling to really crack down on the real estate sector. They're unwilling to do this because it'll slow the growth rates. So the other part of it is there's a different layer of political sensitivity to this, because taxes on households comprise only about 6% of the Chinese budget. It comprises 50% of ours, right? In most of the major prosperous economies, it's much larger than 6%. It's not always as high as the United States, but it's at least 30% or so. And the value-added tax in Europe basically is a regressive tax, right? But it does raise money from households as well as businesses. China relies very, very heavily on taxes from enterprises. Close to 2/3 of the budget in some way are taxes on enterprises. And so when the economy is going well, that revenue stream is, when you're growing 8, 9, 10% a year, it didn't matter, right? Now that it's 2, 3% a year, the things are getting tighter. So there's a lot of wealth and a lot of income that's not taxed. The only thing that's taxed in the household taxation system is salaries. Taxes on income flows from property are almost untouched. No capital gains tax. No inheritance tax. So the question is, why don't they do it? Well, one argument is technical, right? Because they came from a system where when they started to move away from the centrally planned economy, where there were no taxes on households, and households didn't have any really income or wealth worth taxing, there's kind of a path dependence there. They continued to extract state revenues from large enterprises. It's easier to tax a giant enterprise than millions of households. So that's a technical side. But there's a deeper political side, and that is, if you start, for example, to tax property, housing, well, that could cause the housing market to tank. That's going to piss off a lot of ordinary people who have bought homes as their major investment. It's going to cause the value of their housing, of their assets, which is the largest single asset class in China, to decline. So that's sensitive in that way. It's also sensitive because there are a lot of family members of high officials who become very wealthy. And right now, there apparently are rules on the books that you have to disclose your family's income and your property and so forth. Generally speaking, that's not enforced. And this comes very close. If they were going to try to enforce taxes on property, a lot of officials and officials' families are going to have to reveal not only their domestically held property, but their internationally held property. So, maybe there's going to be a sell-off of real estate in Palo Alto. I don't know. But
or Vancouver.
That will be very, what's the word? Divisive. And it means that a shift towards that kind of taxation system, including inheritance tax, right, will meld in with the anti-corruption campaign. And then the problem will be, okay, are you going to go selectively after people who are not part of the Xi Jinping loyalists? Are you going to go selectively towards the private, the people who've legitimately built up businesses like Jack Ma, right, and shake them down? Well, you can shake down the private enterprise people, but that's not an answer to this. So there's a political dimension to moving towards a tax system that will help to reallocate. Like the U.S. and even Russia, if you look at their pre and post redistribution, it's substantial. It's not something that we think, those of us on the liberal side of the political spectrum in the U.S. feel it's still not enough, right? So we don't talk about that. We talk about how unequal things are. In China, the detailed studies of individual policies essentially argue that there's very little net redistribution in this particular policy area, like low-income maintenance programs. And to the extent that it works, it slightly favors urban people, right? And then the data, the broad data analysis reflects that. There's virtually no change in the GDP, maybe just a little bit, right? And so that's kind of part of the puzzle. And so I guess my overall explanation is to get beyond the household. The household survey is very valuable, but to really get a sense of the macro political, macroeconomic causes of this, you have to look at, in many ways, the answer's been staring us in the face for a long time. That the features, the distinctive features of China's the financial system and growth model are generating enormous inequalities that cause China's levels of inequality to be more or less equal to the United States and Russia, and that should not happen. I mean, that should not happen.
It's a communist country.
I mean, it's not communist in the old-fashioned sense, but they're still socialist in the sense that Barry Naughton had a wonderful piece in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. I have to give him credit for this because I read that and that's what gelled this. He said, look, the title of the article was, "Is China Socialist?" And I first heard about this from scholars at the the University of Finance and Economics in Beijing. They said, "You read the Barry Naughton piece?" I said, "No." So I read it, and Barry shows huge control of assets compared to any other major economy. Major spending on industrial policy and ability to steer things. Redistribution, not so much. So he said he didn't answer whether China's socialist, but he said it's a legitimate question. And so I started from that and said, well, how do you explain it? So it's a paradox. And the thing about China, and whether we're talking about inequality or talking about its future growth rate and its national trajectory, there is no other major economy in the world that's been structured like this. And that's why, there's been a lot of talk the last 5 or 6 years, even before COVID, about whether China's going to have a financial crisis. We know it won't be like the US financial crisis, but it's quite possible we wouldn't know how to recognize a financial crisis if we saw one. And I think as I read the specialist literature, there's a lot of really good analysis out there, and what I try to do is just pull it together and synthesize it, and mainly for my teaching here. And my judgment is that high growth rates are not sustainable, that there will likely be a long downward grind in the growth rate. You're going to get you have a whole generation, maybe 2 generations of people now who are much better off than their parents. But that level of improvement is not, that rate of improvement is not going to continue. And I read something recently that somewhere where the writer said that the system has done very good job at creating, generating a new prosperous middle class, but now they have to deal with their demands. And it's unclear to me, they're going to demand things looking forward. Aging population, there's a lot of publicity now about the shrinking population size. Well, that's not new. We've known that was coming for a long time. But when you look at that, the demands are going to be for pension systems, healthcare systems, and haven't been very good at doing that. Been really good at building bridges and container ports and so forth. But if you're a local official up to the present day, you want to make a career. You want to build skyscrapers. You want to redo the port. You want to clean up the river, right? You're not going to build intensive care beds and fund the pension system, and that's a bias in this centralized hierarchy where officials have been rewarded for faster growth rates. So
we may indeed have hit peak China, and we're now in a very different situation.
I've been teaching my classes. I've been more or less arguing that. But whether China becomes like Japan in the future is a question mark. One thing that macroeconomists will argue against that idea and say, look, unlike Japan, China has a gigantic domestic market. Like, and only one other developing economy in world history, modern world history, that had that, and that's the United States. So, you could argue that there's still room for them to build out Western China and so forth. I think the Belt and Road is part of that vision, although they're getting into trouble over the terms of their loans now. But they're going to have to change. And the ultimate constraint on making the changes in the financial system and the ownership system over manufacturing and service industries is that the Communist Party does not want to negotiate, does not want to be in a position to negotiate either with organized citizens or with organizations that possess a lot of financial or economic power. They don't want to be in a position to do that. And that's one of the reasons why they've cracked down on these private firms recently, and the big, I wouldn't call them oligarchs, but the big CEOs like Jack Ma and so forth. They don't want to negotiate. Well, if you don't want to negotiate, that means you have to continue to hold on to the resources. You have to continue to have a state-dominated banking system. You can't cut loose state-owned firms and sell them off to private owners, because that diminishes your control. So I think that's the, in the Marxist sense, that's the fundamental contradiction. I attended the World Congress of Marxism just to see what was going on, because I heard the first one. The Marxists, international Marxists who came back from the first one were so aghast at what they heard there that I thought I had to go and listen to it. And they invited an old a professor that I took several courses on Marxism with as an undergraduate named David Harvey as the keynote speaker. And he gave this big speech where he denounced, the tendency for the international capitalist system to overaccumulate capital, leading to instability and financial crises. And he said, now in China you have been, and this is to a huge hall, right? In China you've made a very good choice to wall yourself off from that financial system. He said, but that doesn't mean the same thing can't happen internally. And I thought to myself, how are the local discussants going to handle this? They totally ignored the argument. Just totally ignored it.
Okay, well that's really fascinating. I think that people are not paying attention sufficiently to these kinds of longer-term issues, and there's a whole layer of discussion about the geopolitical implications of peak China and whether that makes China more dangerous or less dangerous. That's a discussion that we'll have to have in a different context. But in the meantime, Andy, thanks very much. This has been really a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate all of your insights.
Thanks for having me, Frank.
Okay, very good.